Welcome to part 3 of our exploration in North Renaissance painting. What you're looking at now is a comparison between two Renaissance artists from different regions. On the left is a drawing from Leonardo da Vinci's sketchbook entitled Star of Bethlehem. We have not studied Leonardo yet. After this unit, we will be looking at the High Renaissance and going back to Italy and seeing the development of the Renaissance in that region. But one of the things that was interesting about Leonardo was that he was looking for universal principles that governed organic life. So he observed nature, and he was observing and watching the growth patterns of nature, and so he sort of communicated this idea with his drawing. I will show this drawing again in the next subunit when we talk about High Renaissance art, because this is actually this will indicate a return to the sort of radial architecture, the sort of centrally planned church that we talked about with early Byzantine art. So anyway, on the right is a study done by one of the great North European artists, Dürer. And really, they're quite different. Remember, with North Renaissance painting, they were very much interested in surface detail and really depicting sort of every single sort of aspect and sort of moment in what they were sketching. So quite different. And really these two really show sort of the difference, the regional differences in terms of Italian Renaissance and North European Renaissance. And I probably will show this slide again. So this is a self-portrait done by the artist Dürer in the 1500s, and he is considered the father of what we think of today as the graphic arts and design. He worked with engraving and woodcuts. He developed his own monogram to officially sign his works. And it's really important for you to understand the difference, too, between North European artists and Italian Renaissance artists. North European artists were treated much differently than their Italian counterparts. Italian Renaissance artists were admired, and in some cases treated like superstars, which we will see with High Renaissance artists such as Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael. North European artists were often seen as manual labor, so that sort of identity of the artist and sort of this appreciation of the artist quite hasn't developed yet in North Europe. Dürer had traveled to Italy and was very envious of the classical art Italian artists had access to. He really wanted to raise the status of artists in North Europe to the same level as Italy, and so he really pushed for that sort of development in terms of the recognition of artists and how they were treated. Dürer's self-portrait is a frontal view on a central axis typically reserved for royalty and holy figures like Christ. He is an exceptional oil painter, so again, remember North Renaissance artists are very proficient in oil painting. And again, very much like the earlier images we looked at with Jan van Eyck. Notice sort of the depiction of the watery eyes, the wetness, the translucence of the skin, the very detailed sort of texture of the hair. And so when you look at the face as well, you can really sense that he is trying to draw from observation. When we look closely, when we zoom in, we can see that his eyes are different shapes. And so this really is sort of an Italian reference to sort of this looking at nature and trying to imitate nature, which he must have observed when he was visiting in Italy. And again, just always note the incredible attention to detail to his beard, the really tight ringlets of his hair, and then the fur trim, again, of his coat. Quite spectacular. This self-portrait is most remarkable because of its resemblance to many earlier representations of Christ. So it was really interesting that he took a sort of formula for representing Christ and sort of applied it and used it in his own self-portrait. The gesture of his right hand is very suggestive of a blessing as well as emphasizing the hand he creates with. So he's really trying to sort of infuse this sense of divinity within the artist, of his talent, that his hand very much in the way Christ is blessing his worshipers, that in a sense Dürer is doing something similar, that in his painting and his craft there's something divine in the nature of it. And so he is associating art as divine, and his skill as an artist is divine. And this is, again, a way for him to try to elevate his status and identity as an artist. And so that's why I'm showing you the self-portrait. It's not on your list, but it's a really important one for you to know and understand, and something that you probably could reference on a free response question. We'll look at some close-ups and details. So, referring back to the hand, the detail of the hand is most remarkable because of its, oops, sorry, I already read that part, hold on, sorry about that, I was repeating my notes. Anyway, this is just a detail of the hand, and I was just trying to show you, again, the comparison of the blessing gesture of Christ. His forehead is interesting. Notice how there seems to be light sort of reflecting off his forehead. Again, beautifully done, very realistically done, observing the way light really does reflect in nature, but it also symbolizes his intelligence, which, his intelligence guides his hand. And so these are two connections that he's trying to make in his self-portrait. This portrait was painted early in the 1500s and just before Dürer's 29th birthday. So that's pretty amazing. He was only 29 years old when he painted this. It is the last of his 3 painted self-portraits. I don't have time to show you the other 2, but if you go to the Khan Academy website, I think they have videos related to those. And it really is considered one of the most personal, iconic, and complex of his self-portraits, and one that has become fixed in the popular imaginations of viewers. So I really did want to teach this one to you. We will be looking at some of Dürer's woodcuts, which he was very well known for. This is an example of one of his woodcut prints. It's entitled The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and it was a series of woodcuts that he did between 1497 and 98. So this printmaking technique, and that's what it is, it's a printmaking technique, is very difficult to work with. No other artist has been able to capture the detail he did. And so what he had was a wood block, and he would have to sort of cut out these very fine details, and then basically you would lay a sheet of paper on the block and maybe run it through a press, and then you would end up with this print. The print was part of a book designed and created by the artist. It included 14 full illustrations inspired by the Book of Revelations. And this was also important because it was the first book designed and created by an artist. So this is a really important milestone in art history. So he didn't have color to work with at the time, and so he had to really rely on using surface detail to describe the horror and mayhem that's happening in the scene. So I just wanted you to see an example of this, and really why he is considered sort of the father of graphic arts and printmaking, because this is just incredible, the detail he achieved. This is this is an engraving that he did. This was an etching that he would have done on metal as opposed to wood block, done around 1504. Now this one is the one that is listed on the college 250 list, and it depicts Adam and Eve, and he is depicting the biblical couple before the fall, and so he's using them and depicting their bodies as 2 ideal nudes, constructed according to what he believed were perfect proportions as derived from classical theories of beauty. So if you look at their bodies, he really is sort of referencing this classical Greek and Roman tradition of trying to achieve anatomically correct proportions, this defined muscularity in the figure, and sort of these classical ideas related to the human body. Now, you can tell that it's North European because of their faces. So their faces are not idealized. And this is really sort of a typical North European face during this period, where they have this sort of, lack of a chin and a large forehead. And so that's one reason why you can sort of see that it's North European. And so he really is using that, his trip to Italy and probably seeing Greek and Roman classical sculptures and trying to infuse that into his work. With printmaking and this printmaking technique, it's really another milestone in art, because you were able to actually print more, and you were actually able to make more than one copy of a work of art. And so this made art more accessible to a wider audience. And so the middle class could actually purchase prints, and so it really made the distribution of art and the access of art to not just the royal class, but to lower classes as well, available. And so this is why Dürer is really important too, because he really perfected this printmaking technique. Some stylistic details to note. He's observing the play of light on the bodies. He again emphasizes the physical beauty, and it is a metaphor for inspiration, both God's and Dürer's own. This early example of Dürer's interest in ancient Greek and Roman models of ideal physical proportions is filled with symbolic content. So remember, I talked about disguised symbolism. So we have these sort of classical body types, but also we have this North European tradition of surface detail, as well as sort of animals and different things sort of inserted that represents some sort of disguised symbolism. So he's sort of infusing a classical Italian sort of classical Renaissance with the North European love of surface and detail. So again, there's a lot of symbolic content going on. And the figures, and I talked about this early, do have a very typical North European face, which is not idealized. The print is important too, because it also demonstrates the artist's skillful use of engraving techniques. This print was an immediate sensation, and it was widely distributed across the continent, and it became a model for many other artists. So let's look at a detail, and let's talk about some of the disguised symbolism that is present in the composition. So over here, the parrot is supposed to be the embodiment of wisdom and language. It is associated with Adam as opposed to Eve, who feeds the snake. Another important feature of this work is this sort of tag, or this sort of place card that's hanging off the tree branch that Adam holds, and it's inscribed with the words, Albert Dürer of Nuremberg, made this in 1504, hangs, and this is supposed to represent the tree of life. Actually, I'm sorry, this branch is part of a huge tree that is the tree of life. And again, this is supposed to be a witty allusion of Dürer to the immortality of his own art. So like these early, like these Italian Renaissance painters, he's aware of his sense in time in art history, and is taking credit for his work, and not trying to be just a laborer, or just an anonymous craftsman. Note the detail of Adam's head. It really shows how Dürer modeled modeled forms by means of hatching, which is this idea of closely spaced parallel lines, or sometimes also referred to as cross-hatching. Let me see if I can sort of zoom in and show you some examples. But you do kind of get this sense of this sort of cross-hatching technique. So the more dense the lines appear, so here you can sort of see it. So it's not shading, it's not smudged, but the denser and more close together these lines are packed together, the more it indicates this idea of a shadow. If you've ever taken Mr. Kempel's Art 1 class, I'm sure you've learned how to do stippling and cross-hatching with pen and ink. When we look at the bottom of the composition, at Eve's feet, we see a cat preparing to jump on a mouse at Adam's feet, and this is supposed to suggest the introduction of death into the world and indicating this sort of moment of the fall. The four humors are also represented through different animal depictions. The four humors were considered fluids in the body, and they were thought to influence health and personality. Medieval philosophers believed that before the fall, the humors were to be in perfect balance with each other. So the elk over here represents melancholy, black bile. The ox, I'm sorry, this is the elk over here. This must be the ox over here to my right. The ox, sluggish or laziness, which is phlegm. The rabbit, sensuality and blood. And the cat, anger and cruelty, so yellow bile. So this was sort of an early or late sort of medieval philosophy. But anyway, just know that the disguised symbolism of these animals represents the four humors. And again, as always, just really note the extreme depiction of texture and detail on the surface. This is another woodcut. This is by an artist named Lucius Cranach the Elder. It was done in 1530. It was a woodcut, and it was also, later distributed and printed on the letterpress, or the printing press. And this became a very important illustration. I'm going to show you two versions of it. There's a woodcut, and then there's a painting. The painting was done earlier, and I think the painting was really popular, and so they, in order for other people to own it or to have it, Cranach decided to make a woodcut and have it distributed. So one of the things that we need to discuss is the idea of religion in terms of how art functions during this period. And so one of the big questions during this period was exactly how do you get into heaven? Good deeds, can you get yourself into heaven on your own merit, or do you have to sit back and let God do the work? And these were all questions that caused international controversy. Mass looting, vandalism, and killing in the 16th century. So we are sort of in the 16th century. We were in the 15th, and now we're moving into the 16th century. One casualty of the violence and chaos was the destruction of thousands of works of religious arts. Iconoclasts. So this should be familiar to you. Something very similar happened during the Byzantine era as well. And so these iconoclasts were breakers were trying to break likenesses and images of religious figures. And so they stormed through churches, destroying every work of art they could get their hands on. And so one of the themes and questions I want you to think about is, how did this idea of heaven become so controversial? This is supposed to be one of the most influential images of what is known as the Lutheran Reformation. So these questions that we talked about are answered in a surprising kind of picture that Louis Cranach the Elder painted, called The Law and the Gospel. And again, it originally was a painting. I'll show it to you briefly. Done in 1529. The Reformation was initiated by Martin Luther in 1517 and was originally an attempt to reform the Catholic Church. However, reform quickly became rebellion as people began to question the power and practices of the Catholic Church, which had been the only church in Western Europe up until Luther. The role of art is really important as a decisive difference between Catholics followers and of Luther was the question of how to get into heaven and what role, if any, religious art could play. The Catholic Church insisted that believers could take action to vouchsafe their salvation by doing good deeds, including making financial donations and paying for elaborate art decoration for Christian churches. Luther, however, insisted that salvation was in God's hands, and all believers had to do was to open up and have faith. So they were upset. Reformers were upset that people, the Catholics, were trying to sort of buy their way into heaven by, donations and being patron to the arts for churches. So as people became more disillusioned with the Catholic teaching, they also grew very angry, and the ways to the Catholic Church became rich, and they grew angry about the ways the Catholic Church became rich in money, art, and power. When reform became impossible and rebellion was the only course of action, furious, frustrated believers directed their anger at works of art, an easy and powerful target. Other reformers followed Luther's example and staged rebellions against the Catholic Church. Some reformers took a strong position against religious art, forbidding it entirely. Luther, however, was more moderate and believed that some religious art was acceptable, provided it taught the right lesson. And this is where the law and gospel comes in. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it is important for you to understand the Reformation and the role it played. I'm going to use the painting to reference some of the symbolism in the painting and the woodcut. So please, the official picture that you need to know is the woodcut, but also be familiar with the painting. So in consultation with Martin Luther, Louis Cranach the Elder produced the Law and the Gospel. All of Cranach's Lutheran paintings rest upon this pictorial type, which also influenced other artists. The Law and the Gospel explains Luther's ideas in visual form, most basically the notion that heaven is reached through faith in God's grace. Luther despised and rejected the Catholic idea that good deeds, what he called good works, could play any role in salvation. In the composition, we see two nude male figures appear on either side of a tree that is green and living on the gospel side to the viewer's right, but barren and dying on the law side to the viewer's left. Okay, so it sort of is, here's the living side and the dying side. 6 columns of Bible citations appear at the bottom of the panel. So let's look on the right side at a detail. On the gospel side of the image, the right side, John the Baptist directs a naked man to both Christ on the cross in front of the tomb and to the risen Christ who appears on the top of the tomb. The risen Christ stands triumphant above the empty tomb. Here, I'll get back to that. Acting out the miracle of resurrection. The nude figure is not vainly hoping to follow the law or to present a tally of his good deeds on the judgment day. He stands passively, stripped down to his soul, submitting to God's mercy. All right, so let's look at the left part of the picture. In the left foreground, we see a skeleton and demon force a frightened naked man into hell as a group of prophets, including Moses, point to the tablets of the law. The motifs on the left side of the composition are meant to exemplify the idea that law alone, without gospel, can never get you to heaven. Christ sits... So I left off talking about the left portion of the composition, and I want you to pay attention to this area here. So here we see the figure of Christ again, sitting in judgment as Adam and Eve, who are positioned in the background, eat the fruit and fall from grace. Moses beholds these events from his vantage point toward the center of the picture. So somewhere around here. His white tablet, which you can see him holding, his white tablet standing out against the saturated orange robe and the deep green tree behind him, literally highlighting the association of law, death, and damnation. So taken together, these motifs, both on the right and the left side, demonstrate that law leads inescapably to hell when mistaken for a path to salvation, as the damned naked man demonstrates. God judges and God shows mercy. So the composition, the law and gospel, is concerned with two roles that God plays, to judge and to show mercy. On the one hand, God judges and condemns human sin, but on the other hand, God also shows mercy and forgiveness, granting unearned salvation to sinful believers. Luther's idea of law is multifaceted and bears a complex relationship to his idea of gospel. Through law alone will never make salvation possible. It remains indispensable as the way the believer recognizes sin and the need for grace. Law paves the way to salvation by preparing the way for grace. Although the law and gospel includes events from both the New and Old Testament, it is not simply a contrast of Christianity and Judaism. If the law and the gospel simply distinguish between the Old and New Testament, or even more broadly between Judaism and Christianity, then it would not specifically be Lutheran or new, or historically or theologically. Instead, the law and gospel concerns two aspects of the relationship between humanity and God, a relationship based on human action on one hand and the divine power of the other. The law and gospel describes events throughout the Bible which reveal the dual aspect of God's relationship to people. The law and the gospel is Lutheran because it represents Cronach's pictorial translation of Luther's unique understanding of salvation. The painting interprets the role of law, good works, faith, and grace in the human relationship to God. So I know that was quite an earful about religion. So yeah, let's move on to another one. So it's nice. We're going to move away from some religious subject matter and look at something more genre and everyday. So this is a painting done by Pieter Bruegel the Elder, Hunters in the Snow. And what we see is sort of a transition away from some religious subjects. This painting comes from a final burst of creativity in the late period of the artist's life. It is one of a series of 6 large paintings surveying the months of the year. Each picture depicts activities associated with the season represented by 2 months, and each has a dominant seasonal color scheme. This painting represents winter with a snowy color scheme dominated by white, which was a very popular topic in North Europe. There is no use of linear perspective. Instead, there's a sort of use of atmospheric perspective, which is a sort of, we talked about it with early Renaissance painting, the way things in the distance seem to sort of fade out. So, very different in terms of how Italian Renaissance composition would be. Other devices used are this really beautiful repetition of diagonal lines to draw us deeper into the painting. So here you have a diagonal line here, and then it kind of crosses back and forth. And this is what really leads our eye into the painting and gives the painting a sense of depth. Also the scale of the birds, and as I mentioned before, atmospheric perspective give this sense of, draws our eyes into the composition. Let's look at some details. So this appears to be a scene of hunting and obviously frustration at hunting. So look at the figures. They look a little bit hunched over. They look a little defeated. They're not carrying any. One looks like he has something that he's caught, but maybe not a very fruitful hunting expedition. Even the little dogs look kind of disappointed and seem tired. The hunters are trudging into the foreground from the left part of the composition, and again their hunt seems unsuccessful. There's a single hanging fox over the back of one of the hunters, which is the only evidence of their kill. Dogs and masters. The dogs seem to also reflect the hunter's disappointment. Bruegel underlines the human link to nature by projecting the discouragement of the scene onto the gait and manner of the dogs. So they do seem sort of like they're also trudging along in the landscape and seem pretty tired and disappointed. They trail behind, listlessly, even despondent. But one dog does turn his head and to observe the viewer, as if to acknowledge our presence as part of the scene. I think they might be talking about this dog. So let's look at another portion of the picture. And so this is more into the background. So scenes of play are depicted in the distance. So here at the bottom of the hill that they're trudging up, we see a scene of leisure and relaxation, where people are skating on a frozen pond, and there seem to be some pleasant diversions that might await the wary hunters. So there is sort of a nice sort of contrast between these two sort of ways, these two ideas of everyday life, hunting and then, leisure and pleasure. Here's another detail. Again, and you really do get a sense of how he really played around with the atmospheric perspective. Again, how things seem very detailed here in the foreground, and then they become less detailed and more fuzzy and blurry as you move into the background. So again, this is a term that you should know, atmospheric perspective, that he incorporated into his composition. So, let me move. Here's a close-up detail. Here, it looks like this is a pub. And your book points out that there's a sign that dangles from the pub, and it's the sign of the stag. I know it's hard to see, is painted. And so some art historians think that the way, because it's sort of half hanging, it's not fully hanging, it's sort of mockingly underscoring the hunter's disappointment in not coming home with a stag. Some other important elements to note in terms of how our eyes led through the composition are the trees on the hill. They really sort of create these kind of four dark lines, consistently diminishing in size, and this also helps to draw our attention to the hillside on the left. The hunters, fatigued after a long day of hunting, have a long, steep descent ahead of them before they reach the valley below. So some really interesting and innovative things going on compositionally with this landscape depiction. So that's the end of our subunit on 15th and 16th century North Renaissance painting. We are going to be returning back to Italy and be talking about the High Renaissance in our next segment. Thank you.